BBC's coverage of the Israel-Hamas war has been heavily criticised. The broadcaster claimed they're impartial, yet refused to call Hamas terrorists.
On X, formerly Twitter, the Israeli government accused the BBC of perpetuating a modern blood libel in its reporting of the explosion at the hospital in Gaza.
A BBC reporter suggested that Israel was at fault, despite a lack of evidence at the time. US intelligence now suggests the explosion was caused by an errant rocket fired by Palestinian Islamic Jihad.
Well, let's speak to former BBC Radio 4 presenter and editor of Panorama, Roger Bolton. So, Roger, have the BBC got it wrong? They seem to be changing course slightly now on what they're doing. Does it show an Israeli bias at the BBC?
No, and it's ridiculous to compare the blood libel, which was an extraordinarily terrible example of anti-Semitism, with what's happening. No, BBC clearly made a mistake initially in this instance, and a report was said which attributed to Palestinian forces the suggestion that the Israelis had been involved in the latest all in that bombing. The BBC very quickly, when it got other information, changed it and has now said that's a mistake. But the problem a lot of people have here, in the midst of what is clearly a propaganda war, is they say this is a BBC view. There isn't really. There are loads of reporters on the ground trying to report honestly and impartially what they see, and they make mistakes. But if they make mistakes, they should be corrected, and we should be deeply worried if they make a lot of mistakes. But at the moment, they're just trying to give proper coverage to each side when there's a propaganda war going on as well as a military conflict.
Well, you say that, Roger, but we've had the failure to describe Hamas as terrorists, which the BBC seem to be now slightly rowing back on. We had the BBC journalists who were falling over themselves to blame Israel for that airstrike without any evidence for that particular comment. Hold on, I'm going to ask. You can answer. Let me finish my question. We've also had 6 BBC journalists taken off air for pro-Hamas posts. So there does seem to be a pattern of behaviour here, doesn't there? You can't just point out one thing in isolation.
No, but you're pointing out one thing in isolation.
No, there were
3 things there.
Hold on. 54 different languages. It probably transmits about 10 minutes for every 1 minute of real day, whatever. It's trying to report. You are now, like others, picking out individual instances which take them out of context. Look, I think this is an extraordinarily difficult thing to report. I don't blame any Jew for being outraged about the reporting. How would you feel if you were in that circumstances? But the BBC also has to report other things, like, for example, that something like 75 Palestinians have been shot by Israeli settlers in the West Bank. More people than we think now have been killed by the bombing of Israel than were killed in that atrocity, that terrorist atrocity. I'm happy to use that dreadful phrase, but for what was an appalling act.
Well,
but
Roger,
what's going on?
Let me try another one at you, because in 2004 the BBC themselves commissioned the Bolton report on the back of complaints of anti-Israeli bias at the BBC. The BBC have never published that report. Indeed, they went all the way to the Supreme Court to prevent publication of that report. Why don't the BBC just publish it and we can see for ourselves what the BBC thinks about its own bias in an internal report?
Well, hold on, this is 19 years ago. I presume there have to be some internal reports that can keep quiet, but I think they should publish it. And I think more generally, a fair criticism of the BBC is that it doesn't explain why it's doing various things. It does, by the way, call Hamas. It says it's called a terrorist organization by several governments, including the British government. It has described or has used the word terror for these attacks. But one of the problems you've got here, 2 things. One is the BBC, anything it does, and it does so much, is picked up by one side or another, and they say this is symptomatic of everything the BBC does. It isn't. It's a fundamental misunderstanding. There is not a BBC view about that conflict. There is a BBC attempt to report it impartially. That's a different matter. But the BBC should be more open and explain to people what they're saying and listen to what people say, because it is our
Roger, we always have you on because you are always straight talking, and like you said there, you wouldn't have had any problem whatsoever in revealing the contents of that report. One thing, though, I'd like to know your opinion of: Tim Davie is coming to Parliament next week to speak to the 1922 backbench committee of the Tory party. There'll be Tory MPs there. I think this was put in place prior to this bias. It was talking about general impartiality. What do you think of him going to Parliament to speak to Conservative MPs?
Well, so he should. If he's summoned by MPs, he should go and explain himself. I mean, BBC's non-dictatorship should be answerable to Parliament, but to all of Parliament. By the way, 40 years ago, in the Falklands conflict, the BBC chairman was summoned up to Tory MPs, and it was called, because the chairman, George Howard, was a large man, it was called an ox roasting. Tim Davie is rather slimmer, but I think he'll have a very tough time. But of course he should go. But he should be answerable to everybody.
Just very quickly, if you can, Roger. BBC Parliament, their coverage yesterday of Andrew Bridgen's speech on excess deaths had a load of straps throughout it, in effect putting a contrary argument at the bottom of the straps to the one that Andrew Bridgen was making. I've never known that before on a BBC Parliament channel, where I always thought they just said this is the person speaking and this is what the debate's on. What do you make? Should people be concerned that the BBC is starting to sort of, in effect, start trying to predict whether or not what somebody, an MP, saying in Parliament is right or wrong? That seems a slippery slope to me.
Yeah, and I'm sure they weren't doing that. I can't comment precisely on what you're saying because I didn't know about it. But I know what the BBC is trying to do, and it's partly because of what Donald Trump is doing in America, is how do you deal with people who, tell untruths? I don't know whether Andrew Bridgen did or not. And what the BBC is trying to do through Verified elsewhere is where they think there's a factual mistake, they're trying to correct it, and they have fact checks. Now, in this case, and I don't know about it, but it may be that they were making a fact check. It's very good. They should be very careful about it. But then, I think if the BBC were to say Andrew Bridgen is talking rubbish, that would be disgraceful. If they say Andrew Bridgen quoted this, actually this is the accurate figure, different matter. BBC shouldn't get in the business of commentating. It should be and stick to the business of reporting.
Thank you very much, as ever, for your forthright opinions. We very much appreciate your time.